They auctioned a dead man's land on a Friday, and the dead man's widow stood at the front of the crowd so no one would have to wonder where to look. It was October in Coldwater Hollow, the cold already coming off the ridge in the mornings, and the whole valley had turned out the way a valley does when there is something to watch and no charge for the watching. Esther Calloway was 25 years old. She had buried Thomas in the spring and worked the homestead alone through the summer. And when the note came due in the fall, she had ridden into town with her chin level and her hands folded over the worn leather of a satchel that held everything she still called hers. She did not cry, and she did not look away from the auctioneer, and that steadiness was the thing the town could not decide how to feel about. A woman near the dry goods porch said it was unnatural. A woman beside her said it was pride. Esther heard them both and let them be wrong. The auctioneer was a heavy man named Royce Tatum, who read debts aloud the way some men read Scripture for the carrying power of it. He stood on the wagon bed with the deed in his fist, and he announced the Calloway quarter section to the open air, the 80 acres along Coldwater Creek, the cabin, the barn that Thomas had raised with his own hands the first autumn they were married. He named the back taxes. He named the unpaid note at the bank. He named the figure a man would have to put down to take it all, and the figure was small, because misfortune is cheap when it belongs to a woman alone. There was a man at the front of the bidding called Garrett Voss, who held the note. He owned the feed store and a good deal of the valley besides, and he had been buying up the small places one funeral at a time. He had offered Esther a price for the land in July, in private, on her own porch, and the price had come with a look she did not care for and a suggestion that a young widow had other ways to settle a debt if she were sensible about it. She had told him no, and she had told him to mind the step on his way down, because it was loose and she had not yet fixed it. He had not forgotten the no. He stood now, with his thumbs in his vest, and the comfortable patience of a man who had already counted the money in his head. Across the square, near the smithy, a man came out into the cold and stopped on the step to watch. He was 36, broad through the shoulders, with a quiet face and hands that had spent their life around horses. His name was Caleb Hartwell, and he ran a small horse outfit 2 miles north along the creek, the next quarter up from the Calloway place. He had known Thomas a little and traded work with him at branding, and he had ridden past Esther's fence enough times over the summer to see that the woman alone up there had kept the fences tight and the stock fed and the wood split, which said plenty. He had come to town that morning for nails. He stood with the nails in his coat pocket and watched Royce Tatum hold a dead man's whole life up in one fist, and he watched the widow stand straight through it, and he watched Garrett Voss wait to take it, and something in him decided a thing before the rest of him had words for it. Tatum called for the bid. Voss raised his hand without hurry and named the note figure, flat, the way a man names a thing he already owns. Tatum asked twice, for more, for form's sake, looking out over a crowd that everyone present knew would not answer, and the silence after the second asking had the particular weight of a thing finished. Esther kept her eyes forward. She had told herself in the dark of that morning that she would not flinch when it landed, and she meant to keep the one promise still in her power to keep. Then a voice from the edge of the square said, plainly, "I'll go higher." Heads turned. Caleb Hartwell came down off the smithy step and crossed the open ground without any hurry at all. And the crowd opened for him the way crowds open for a man who is not performing. He stopped a few feet from the wagon bed and named a figure above Voss's, and he named it once, without ornament. Tatum blinked and repeated it back to be sure. Voss turned and looked at Hartwell the way a man looks at a fence he had not expected to find across his road. And after a moment he raised the bit again, a little sharp now, the patience gone thin at the edges. Caleb did not look at Voss. He looked at the auctioneer, and he went higher, and he kept his hand in his coat pocket where the money was while he did it. Twice more Voss raised, and twice more Caleb answered, even and unbothered, until the figure had climbed past Sensible, and Garrett Voss understood that the horsebreaker meant to spend whatever it took and would not be hurried into a mistake. Voss did the arithmetic of a man who only ever spent money he expected to get back, and he could not see how he got this back, and so he closed his mouth. Tatum asked a third time into a silence that had changed its nature entirely. Then he brought his hand down on the wagon rail and said the land was sold, and he said Caleb Hartwell's name. And the valley let out a breath it had been holding without knowing it. Esther had not moved through any of it. She turned now and looked at the man who had just spent more money than the place was worth, and she found she did not know him well enough to know why. Caleb walked to the wagon, counted the sum into Royce Tatum's hands in front of the whole town so there could be no later argument about it, and took the folded deed. Then he walked back to where Esther stood with her satchel, and he held the deed out to her. "This is yours," he said. "It always was." She looked at the paper and did not take it. "I can't pay you back," she said. Her voice was level. She was not too proud to say the true thing. She was only too honest to pretend otherwise. "I didn't buy it to be paid back," he said. "I bought it so the wrong man wouldn't have it." He pressed the deed gently until her hand came up under it, and then it was hers, and he stepped back so the giving could not look like a claim. "Your fences are good," he added, as if that explained everything, and to him perhaps it did. A man can tell what a place is worth by who's been keeping it. Garrett Voss left the square without a word, and the town watched him go, and then the town looked at the widow holding her own deed, and then it looked at the horsebreaker already walking back toward the livery for his mount. And the talk that started up was a different kind of talk than the talk that had started the morning. Esther rode home that afternoon to a house she still owned and could not have said how. She put the deed in the tin box with Thomas's pocket watch and the pressed wedding ribbon, and she set the box back on its shelf above the hearth where it had sat for 2 years. And she stood a long while looking at it. She had braced for losing everything, and she had lost nothing, and a person does not always know what to do with a mercy she did not arrange for herself. That night she lay awake and could not find the bottom of why a man would do such a thing, and the not knowing kept her up later than the worry ever had. He did not come the next day, which she noted, or the day after. On the third morning she found her woodpile split and stacked at the side of the cabin, every length squared and true, and no one anywhere in sight. She stood in the doorway with a shawl around her and looked at the wood and understood that he must have come before light and gone before she woke, so that the help would not have to be thanked, and so she would not have to feel owing. She said nothing about it. But the next morning she rose earlier than she had in months, and she had coffee hot on the stove and a second cup set out on the rail of the porch when the gray came up over the ridge, and a little while later she heard a horse on the north trail. And Caleb Hartwell rode into the yard and saw the cup waiting and understood it for exactly what it was. He drank the coffee on the step without coming in, which was correct, and they did not say a great deal. He asked after the milk cow that had been favoring a leg, and she told him it had mended. He looked at the loose step she had warned Voss about in July, and which she still had not fixed, and he did not mention it, but the following morning it was fixed. The board pulled and reset and nailed flush, and she did not mention it either. So it went, through the back end of October and into the hard, bright cold of November. He came on the mornings he could and worked the fence line up the shared creek where his land met hers, and she fed him from her stove, and the patch of ground between them filled up slow with a kind of trust that does not get spoken, because speaking it would make it smaller than it was. There was a boy in it, too. Caleb had a nephew, a thin, watchful child of 7 named Sam. His late sister's son left to Caleb when the diphtheria took both parents in the same week 2 winters past. The boy had not had much use for strangers since, and less for women, having decided in the private logic of grief that people who came close were people the world then took away. When Caleb first brought him along on a fence morning, Sam stood by the horse and would not come to the house and would not eat at the table, and Esther did not push him. She set a plate on the porch rail the way she had set the coffee cup, and she went on with her work and let him be, and over a string of mornings the plate started coming back empty. And then, one cold day, she looked up from the wash kettle, and the boy was standing in the kitchen doorway watching her stir, having decided on his own to come in out of the wind. She handed him the spoon to taste without making any ceremony of it, and he tasted it and allowed that it was good, and that was the whole of it, and it was a great deal. By the 2nd week of November the valley had noticed. A valley always notices. And a valley that had spent a Friday morning enjoying a widow's ruin did not entirely care to spend a November watching that same widow warmed back to life, because some people would rather be proved right about a sad ending than be made glad by a happy one. The prepared voices started in at the feed store, where they did their best work. There was a woman named Lavinia Crane who had appointed herself the keeper of the town's accounts on such matters, and she said, where she meant to be heard, that it was a curious thing how quick a young widow could find a new man to keep her, and that a woman who lost a husband in the spring and had another's wood split by her door come fall was a woman worth wondering about. She said there had been talk, even before Thomas died, about where Esther Calloway had come from and what she had been before she came west, an orphanage girl with no people to speak for her, and therefore no reason to believe she was what she claimed. She said it the way such things are always said as concerned, with the knife wrapped in it. The talk reached the creek the way cold reaches a house, through every crack at once. Caleb heard it at the livery. Esther heard it from the one neighbor woman who was kind enough or unkind enough to bring it to her directly. And for a few days the warmth between the two places pulled back like water before a frost. Esther stopped setting the cup on the rail, not from any change of heart, but from a fear that she was costing the man his good name, and Caleb, sensing the withdrawal and mistaking its reason, came less, not wanting to crowd a woman who might be reconsidering. So they each went carefully cold to spare the other, which is the particular foolishness of two decent people, and the gossip fed on the gap it had made. Then Garrett Voss came back. He had not finished with the matter. Men like Voss seldom do. He had ridden to the county seat and come home with a paper of his own, and on a Saturday with the town out, he stood up on the boardwalk in front of the dry goods store with Lavinia Crane's talk for kindling, and announced that the Callaway note had carried a lien he held separate from the auction debt. A private loan, he said, Thomas had taken from him the winter before he died, and that by his figuring the widow owed him still, deed or no deed, and that he meant to collect it or take the land in lieu, and that no horsebreaker's grand gesture had cleared what was owed to him. He had the paper to wave, and a paper waved loud enough in front of a watching town can do the work of a true thing for as long as it takes. Esther stood in the street and looked at the paper and felt the old cold come up in her, the cold of being a woman alone with no one to speak for her, and she made herself stand straight in it the way she had stood straight in the auction. She said plainly that Thomas had borrowed no such money, that she had kept his accounts and knew them to the penny, and that she would not be frightened off her own ground by a paper a man could have drawn up in any back office in the county seat. But she had no document to set against his, and a watching crowd weighs paper against a woman's word and too often finds the paper heavier. And she could feel the morning tilting the wrong way. It was then that Caleb Hartwell came up the street, having heard from the livery boy that Voss was on the boardwalk again. He did not come fast, and he did not come loud. He came and stood beside Esther, square in front of the town that had watched her ruined in October, and he looked at the paper in Voss's hand for a long moment. Then he said that he knew that lien for a lie, because the winter Voss claimed Thomas had borrowed the money. Thomas Callaway had not borrowed $1 from any man. He had sold Caleb 4 horses that same winter to clear his own books, and Caleb had the bill of sale and the dates, and a man who is selling horses to pay his debts is not a man taking out secret loans in the same season. He said he would put that bill of sale in front of any judge in the territory and let an honest man do the arithmetic. And then he reached into his coat and took out a roll of money, the money the town would learn that he had been setting by for 3 years to buy the breeding stallion that would have made his outfit something more than small, and he held it out toward Voss. "That's the whole of the lien you say you're owed counted out here in front of everyone," Caleb said. "Take it, and we'll have a court look at your paper and my bill of sale, and we'll see whose holds. Or admit there's nothing to take and ride home." His voice did not rise. That settles the lien, the loan, and every excuse you rode in with. It does not buy her, and it never could. It only takes the last thing you thought you had over her. Now go. The town looked at the money and at the bill of sale Caleb had drawn from his other pocket, and at Garrett Voss, who had built his whole power in the valley on never once being made to prove a thing in the open. Voss looked at the roll of money offered to him like a dare, and he understood that taking it meant a courtroom and a date he could not win, and refusing it meant admitting in front of the whole town that the lien was air. He did neither cleanly. He folded the paper and said something about the matter not being finished, and he turned and walked to his horse, and the town watched him go for the second time that autumn. And this time it did not wonder which way to lean. Lavinia Crane found she had a great deal of shopping to attend to and could not be drawn into comment. Caleb put the money back in his coat unspent, and the breeding stallion stayed a thing he had not bought, and he seemed to count that a fair trade. He turned to Esther in the street in front of all of them, and for once he did look as though he might have a thing to say that he had not yet found the plain words for. But the street was not the place, and he knew it, and so he only walked her to her wagon and saw her up onto the seat and told her he would ride out the next morning, and she said she would have coffee on. He came the next morning, and the morning after, and the frost was on the fence post now, and the last color was gone from the pasture, and the boy Sam rode at his uncle's stirrup as though he had always belonged there, and came straight into the kitchen now without being asked. Near the end of November, on a still cold morning, with the smoke standing straight up off both their chimneys. Caleb stood on Esther's porch with his hat in his hands and said the thing he had been carrying since the smithy step in October. "I didn't buy your land to make you owe me," he said, "and I don't want you to stay because of it. But the boy says your name in the morning before he says mine, and I find I look for your smoke off the ridge before I'm rightly awake. And that's not a thing I can fix by working a fence." He turned the hat once in his hands. "I'd like you to stay, as my wife. If that's what you want. Your land stays your land. In your name, the deed in your box. I'm not asking for the ground. I'm asking for you." Esther let the silence sit. She had earned the right to take it slow, and he had earned the patience to let her. And neither of them hurried it. She looked off at the 2 threads of smoke standing in the cold air, his and hers, 2 miles apart, and the fence line between them, mended now end to end by his hands and fed by her stove. She thought of the cup on the rail, and the step pulled flush without a word, and the money he had offered a liar rather than spend on his own long dream. Then she looked at the man and at the boy waiting in the doorway behind him with the whole of his small, careful heart in his face. "Yes," she said, "that's what I want." They were married in December in the small church in Coldwater Hollow, with the same valley in the pews that had stood in the square in October, and a good number of them had the grace to look glad. And the few who did not kept it to themselves, which was the most that could be asked of them. The boy Sam carried the ring on a length of harness leather because it was what he had, and no one corrected him. By the first true snow, the 2 places ran as one. Caleb's horses wintered in the bigger of the 2 barns, and Esther's deed stayed in the tin box on the shelf above the hearth. In her own name, beside Thomas's watch and the pressed ribbon, with a new thing added now, the bill of sale that had broken a liar in the street, kept not for what it proved about Voss, but for what it told her about the man who had carried it folded in his coat, for her sake, before he ever spoke a word of feeling. On the cold morning she rose and built the fire and set the coffee on. And 3 sets of boots came in out of the dark, the man's and the boy's, and, before long, the small uneven prints of a second child that came to them the following autumn. And Sam, who had decided once that the world took away everyone who came close, learned slowly and then all at once that it does not always, and one ordinary winter morning at the table he called her Mama without thinking about it. The way you say a thing you have already decided is true. And Esther went on stirring and did not make more of it than it was. And that was the largest thing that ever happened in that house. And that was the story of Esther Calloway, a widow who rode into town on a Friday to lose everything and rode home owning her own ground, and the quiet word of a man who knew that you can tell what a place is worth by who has been keeping it. Tell me in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.